Remember, you can find and subscribe to all the episodes of this podcast at historyasithappens.com. And you can sign up for my newsletter. Just enter your email in the box that pops up at the bottom of the screen. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter every Friday. historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, August 11, 2022. The problem with prohibitions.
Bottom line, Roe versus Wade is overruled. There is no constitutional right to an abortion.
Where did privacy and personal freedom begin, and where did they end?
The young girl traveled across state lines into Indiana to get the procedure.
A 10-year-old rape survivor from Ohio had to cross the state lines to get an abortion.
I believe it would probably impact her life, and so therefore it would fall under any exception and would not be an abortion.
It would not be an abortion if a 10-year-old with her parents made the decision not to have a baby that was a result of a rape.
It is a shame that it happens, but there's an opportunity for that woman, no matter how young or old she is.
Surprising vote overnight in Kansas, the first state to vote on abortion since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
This was a massive show of support for abortion rights.
One day after Kansas voters rejected a measure to remove abortion rights from the state's constitution, President Biden announced a new executive order to assist abortion seekers.
For decades, neither side in the conflict over abortion had to defend its position in the Democratic arena. Roe versus Wade had settled the question. But in the first test of post-Roe America, abortion rights supporters scored a major victory. A majority made clear abortion should not be banned in Kansas. What can we learn from past prohibitions about the difficulty in enforcing a moral code? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The idea that it's my body. You can't tell me the government can't tell me what I can and cannot do with my body. And that's a very strong sentiment, I think, which in Kansas seemed to appeal to some people who are conservative on other issues, but not in this one.
When it comes to the great movements in American history, like civil rights, certain names come to mind immediately, right? A. Philip Randolph, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., movements that changed America, left a lasting mark. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. We remember them because they succeeded and made our country a better place in the process.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But there have been major social movements that changed America, whose leaders are mostly forgotten today. Have you heard of Billy Sunday?
America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her.
He started out as a baseball player in the 1880s, but that's not where he really left his mark. In the late 1880s, he converted to Christianity and became a moral scold, denouncing vice, drinking, gambling, you name it. And in the 1890s, Sunday struck out, no pun intended, on his own as an itinerant evangelist preacher, and he became one of the most influential temperance crusaders on the road to Prohibition. Does anyone fondly remember the Prohibitionists today? The people who convinced enough of their fellow Americans that it was the right idea to amend the Constitution to outlaw booze in a nation of drinkers. Prohibition was a disaster.
Images of people getting arrested for putting something in their bodies that is liquor is something which Americans didn't like in the 1920s, proved unenforceable. Power law, I think, is already happening, actually, with abortion, with stories like that terrible story of the 10-year-old from Ohio had to go to Indiana to get an abortion.
Historian Michael Kazin is with us today. In a New York Times op-ed, he compared the crusade to ban alcohol to the current battle over abortion. That is, banning abortion may prove impossible, because the argument goes, most Americans don't want to throw doctors who perform the procedure in prison. Most Americans don't want to fence women into their home states, punishing them or a clinic if they travel to a state where abortion is legal. Beyond moral questions, there are also practical concerns, right? During Prohibition, there weren't nearly enough police to enforce the law. By banning booze, the temperance crusaders created a black market for it, turning street thugs like Alphonse Capone into legendary kingpins. Immortalized in the movie The Untouchables, where the brave G-men go after the bootleggers, and they were the heroes. Hello, Robert De Niro.
Like a lot of things in life, we laugh because it's funny and we laugh because it's true. Some people say, reformers here say, put that man in jail. What does he think he is doing? What I hope I'm doing, and here's where your English paper's got a point, is I'm responding to the will of the people. People are going to drink. You know that. I know that. We all know that. And all I do is act on that. And all this talk of bootlegging. What is bootlegging? On the boat, it's bootlegging. On Lakeshore Drive, it's hospitality. I'm a businessman.
So can we really compare drinking a beer to ending a pregnancy? After all, having a drink is a personal choice that affects no one else. Whereas an abortion involves an unborn child. Another party is intimately involved. Well, the temperance crusaders would have disagreed with that. They would have pointed to all the social ills caused by alcoholism, like public drunkenness and domestic abuse. So back to Billy Sunday. He was still around in 1933 when Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, also known as the Volstead Act, was being repealed. And here he is in one of his sermons announcing himself as the sworn, eternal, uncompromising enemy of the liquor traffic.
They say, well, Prohibition has brought on the Depression. Well, what's brought on the world? The Depression is worldwide. The saloons are dead as an Egyptian mummy. She's too dead to skin. But her ghost hangs like a moral paralysis over our land, but no man, woman, or child alive today will ever live to see the stars and stripes wave over an open licensed saloon in the United States of America. I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth, and when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gull it till I go home to heaven and it goes home, my friend, to hell.
Sunday was a leader of an army of Christian evangelists who were fanatically opposed to the evils of alcohol. But many Americans, as you might imagine, quickly grew tired of such moralizing when they could see for themselves the real-world consequences of their holy crusade. Michael Kazin is a distinguished and prolific historian of American political and social movements at Georgetown University. His latest book is What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. Our conversation is the latest in a series of episodes I've produced, examining the different dimensions of the abortion debate post-Roe. Over the past several weeks, we've covered the legal arguments, privacy concerns, the history of abortion in 18th and 19th century America. You can search for those episodes wherever you find this podcast. Michael Kazin, welcome back.
Great to be here again.
You wrote an op-ed, or they call it a guest essay now, in the Other Times, titled, Even if Republicans Outlaw Abortion, Americans Will Soon Rebel. You wrote, a movement that seeks to compel Americans to live according to a stringent moral code may be most vulnerable when it succeeds. You wrote this prior to the vote in Kansas. What were your thoughts about that vote?
Well, as a supporter of reproductive rights, I was happy to see it. And it surprised people, I think, because obviously Kansas is seen as a Republican state, as a red state. And we tend to equate being Republican with being anti-abortion, being pro-life. But in fact, lots of Republicans are on the fence, ambivalent, might want some restrictions on abortions, but not a complete ban on abortions. And of course, what they were trying to do was change the Constitution in Kansas, which is always a rather radical thing to do. A lot of people feel it's quite radical to change the Constitution. And you've got a Democratic governor there who supported the right to an abortion. So it's not a state where there are a lot of evangelical Protestants, actually, the way there are, say, in Mississippi or Alabama, or very conservative Catholics, the way there are in Louisiana, people who are the backbone of the anti-abortion movement nationwide. So in that sense, Kansas was the exception proves the rule or something. That is, it's a Republican state, but not one that is deeply religious, I think. Not one full of deeply religious Christians who are the group that is most opposed to abortion.
I wasn't entirely surprised by it either, for the reasons you just mentioned. But also, this is the first time now that the Christian right, or conservative voters, Christian conservatives, have to defend the idea of, well, what do you do now that Roe versus Wade is gone? Do you want to outlaw all abortions? Do you want to throw doctors in prison who assist women in illegal abortions? And this was one of the observations in your guest essay. It moves from an issue only about abortion into other areas. The idea that the government has simply gone too far into people's lives.
Yeah, Americans, from whatever point of view, they love freedom. We love liberty. We love the idea that the government can't force you to do what it might want you to do with your life. You know, there's often a lot of opposition in American history to the draft. You know, we have the draft very consistently in American history, unlike that of a lot of countries where people just take it for granted that young men and now young women are going to have to serve in the military. You know, I think that sometimes works for conservatives, not wanting a lot of regulations on corporations, not wanting to compel people to join a union when there's a union in their workplace. So you have right to work laws that get passed states, but it also works for abortion rights in many ways, I think, too. The idea that it's my body. You can't tell me the government can't tell me what I can and cannot do with my body. And that's a very strong sentiment, I think, which in Kansas seemed to appeal to some people who are conservative on other issues, but not in this one.
About 60% of voters supported abortion rights in that vote in Kansas. So let's dive into the history and the parallels you drew in your essay about prohibition, capital P prohibition, the banning of booze in the United States, and the temperance movement. When did the temperance movement, which was, of course, focused on one issue and one issue only, Americans were drinking too much, at least in their opinion. When did the temperance movement emerge in the United States?
It really began before the Civil War, actually. There were groups called the Washingtonians, mainly made up of men who wanted to convince other men to not drink, to bring home their paychecks to their families and not use it to treat their friends at the tavern. And in fact, the first prohibition law was a state law passed in Maine in the 1850s. It was hard to enforce, like the prohibition laws later on would be as well. But even before, there was a mass prohibition movement involving lots of churches and lots of women, as there was in the late 19th century, early 20th century. There was a prohibition movement powerful enough to ban the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages in one state, where there are mostly evangelical Christians in that state, Maine. But really, the mass movement, textbooks talk about, that people hear about, that Ken Burns made a documentary about once, really begins in the early 1870s when there's a group of women in Ohio who decided to try to close down the taverns in their small towns, sat down, they committed civil disobedience in front of the taverns and tried to stop men from going into the taverns, and they prayed with their Bibles in hand in front of these taverns. It's called the Women's Crusade, and that gave birth to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a mass organization, the largest women's organization in American history to that point, over 100,000 members. And then in the 1890s, a different organization made up primarily of male ministers called the Anti-Saloon League was formed. And it was the group that really pushed forward the Prohibition Amendment, having national prohibition, not just working on the state level. And it was very influential. The Anti-Saloon League was among Democrats in the South and among Republicans in the North and the West. And it did something which is very hard to do, which is to change the Constitution, because you need, of course, as all you listeners are so well informed about politics know, you need 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures to pass an amendment. So clearly it was a very popular idea at the time.
And to your point about enforcement, when it comes to enforcing laws, especially laws dealing with personal behavior, it's always so thorny and tricky, really impossible. Enforcement is never even. We'll get back to that in a bit. So this was very much a religious movement, like the pro-life movement today. It was driven by devoutly religious people.
I think so. And also it was seen very much as a reform. I mean, that's important to note. Certainly, pro-life people today think what they're doing is a great reform. They think they're, of course, saving the lives of human beings. Nothing more reformist than that, if you believe that. But the Prohibition movement, which, by the way, did not want to penalize people for actually taking a drink, it was trying to hit at the industry, at the commerce, the liquor trust, the commerce in alcoholic beverages. So even under Prohibition, it was not illegal to actually take a drink. It was illegal to buy a drink, and it was illegal to make alcoholic beverages.
Well, it's like laws today where you can't smoke the marijuana in public, but you're allowed to buy it or something like that.
Yeah. Or you can smoke in public, like in D.C., where I live and where you live too, I think, Mark. Yeah. You can actually smoke marijuana in public, but you're not supposed to be able to buy it.
That's right. I got it mixed up there. I wish they weren't smoking it right outside my apartment building some days.
That, a lot of people who were, on the left politically in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, who were also devout Christians, especially evangelical Protestants, supported Prohibition because they thought it would clean up the corruption that the alcoholic beverage industry and the saloon interests were in part responsible for. There's a lot of payoffs between saloon owners and distilleries and breweries and politicians. There's a famous anecdote told by the great muckraker Lincoln Steffens. He said at one point, some witty person walked into the St. Louis City Council meeting and said, "Sir, your saloon's on fire." And half the city council members dashed out because there was such a direct connection between, and saloons operated many cities 24 hours a day or 20 hours a day, and kids as young as 8 years old could buy alcoholic beverages if they promised to bring it back to their parents. But of course, the kids would often drink a little bit on the way and give to their friends. So there were a lot of abuses connected with alcohol.
I wanted to ask you the extent of the problem, alcoholism in 19th century America.
It was a serious problem, especially for working class men who drank a lot and could not afford it because their wages were so low. I mean, when the average wage in America was about $2 a day in the 1890s and beer cost a nickel, well, if you buy a beer for yourself on the way home, that's fine. But then if your buddies say, hey, Mac, how about me? And you buy them drinks, before you know it, you will have spent a quarter of your daily wage, and there's not much left for your wife and the kids. It was a serious problem. But as we'll talk about later, banning the sale of it didn't make it easier. In some ways, it made it worse because it became sort of hip to drink in the big cities, especially among upper and middle class people.
When anything is taboo, that makes people want to do it.
Yep.
So the temperance crusaders, we'll call them, they were into moral suasion, but they also wanted to pass laws to ban booze. They went after the manufacturers, but it also sounds like they were at least trying to convince individuals not to drink either. What kind of tactics did they use? You referenced some of these before, showing up at saloons and praying or whatever. What kind of tactics did they employ?
Oh, everything you can imagine. There were, of course, sermons. The famous evangelist Billy Sunday gave a sermon called the Booze Sermon, which was his most popular sermon, and he got 15,000, 20,000 people to listen to the sermon in different cities.
He was an itinerant preacher, right?
Yeah, and then got them the men to come up in front and swear they would not have a drop of liquor again. There was a lot of educational pamphlets about the harm that alcohol did to the body. There were very melodramatic plays and even silent films about drunkards who destroyed their families, destroyed themselves, committed suicide. So it was really a many-sided appeal. And also the early 20th century was what historians call the progressive era.
That's right.
And again, as I mentioned, it was a lot of women were very important in the Prohibition movement, including, great reformers like Jane Addams and Frances Willard, who was the head of the WCTU that I mentioned before, because they really felt that these were industries which are preying on women indirectly through convincing men to drink a lot and to waste their wages on alcohol. And so actually, the WCTU, before the vote was won by women, called for what they called a home protection ballot. That is, they wanted women to be able to vote in local elections, primarily so they could outlaw the saloon in those areas.
Your essay in the New York Times introduced me or reminded me of some influential individuals I had forgotten about or I'd never heard of before, like Carrie Nation. What a delight she must have been. Showing up at saloons with hatchets, and she did this repeatedly. She got arrested, but she would go with her army of temperance crusaders. She would show up to bars and saloons and destroy their property with a hatchet.
Yes, bars used to have, some still do, the old-fashioned ones, had these huge mirrors, right, over the bar, where you could see yourself, and it sort of added to conviviality, I think, of the life of the saloon. Well, of course, those were some of the most expensive things in the bar besides the alcohol themselves. And so she went right for that mirror and smashed it. She got arrested for doing it, but this was an act of rather uncivil disobedience. But important to note that she did this in Kansas, where she was from. And when she did it in Kansas, she was actually enforcing the law as a vigilante. Kansas had a law.
1880, right?
Yeah, 1880s, calling for prohibition. And the law was not being enforced in the cities, places like Topeka and Wichita, Manhattan, Kansas. So in that sense, she was enforcing the law, but the law didn't allow people to go and destroy saloons.
That's right. The parallel today would be folks who show up at abortion clinics and intimidate the people going in and out, or even worse, right? So... Right. You mentioned the Kansas law, the dry law of 1880. All throughout this chapter, of our nation's history, there was always pushback against temperance, right? I mean, they did manage to somehow convince a majority of the people to amend the Constitution by 1920. But all throughout this drama, there were many, many Americans who did not want to go along with this, right?
Oh, yeah. And it was very much, you talked about religious zeal before. Really, this was unlike abortion. The only group that was really involved in a serious way were evangelical Protestants. Now, they were the majority of the population, I should note, 100 years ago, which they are not today. But Catholics were almost all opposed to it. You know, very devout Catholics have been drinking and selling alcohol for many, many years, and they had no problem with it. Also, politically, Irish Catholics were a very important group in the urban populations, and they were often the ones who ran saloons. And German Catholics, Germans generally, but especially German Catholics, were the main brewers of beer. Pabst and Schlitz and the other big brands all had German names, Miller.
Yeah, try telling a German not to drink beer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Beer gardens, right? You know, it's sort of part of German culture. And of course, for Irish Catholics, drinking was part of their culture too, whiskey as much as beer. So Italians, Catholics could imagine, not being able to have wine.
So had a great bottle of wine over the weekend, but go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was also true for Jews. Wine is part of the ritual every week on the Sabbath and especially on certain high holy days. So this is very much an evangelical Protestant issue, both among conservative evangelicals and more reform-minded evangelicals. But it was not something they were able to convince people of other faiths to accept.
So there were some ethnic immigrant dimensions to this controversy. Many of these immigrants were Democratic voters, right?
A lot of them were, yeah, depending on the group, but especially the Catholic and Jewish ones were, yeah. There was a real use of anti-immigrant propaganda by the Prohibitionist movement. There were lots of cartoons of swarthy, mustachioed, evil-eyed German tavern owners debauching young women who were anywhere near their bars and so forth. And of course, in World War I, once the Germans were the enemy of the United States, that's when Prohibition won in Congress and then in the state legislatures. And that's not an accident. The German Brewers Association, which was almost entirely German-American, of course, was opposed to Prohibition, but couldn't really be a very active German-American in politics during World War I.
That's right. Your op-ed speaks to the importance of not drawing conclusions about any historical period based on the laws that may have existed, right? You just don't open a book and say, well, alcohol was illegal in Kansas, therefore no one was drinking. We know that enforcement is always uneven. 1913, Congress actually enacts a ban on shipping alcoholic beverages to the states that had already banned booze. Congress enacts a ban in 1913. What happened to that ban? Did it work?
It's called the Webb-Kenyon Act. Yeah. And, it was not so different from some of the bills that anti-abortion state legislatures are trying to pass today to stop people from going outside the state to have an abortion. Of course, with the Webb-Kenyon Act, the idea was to ban people from bringing alcohol into the state. Well, it was very hard to enforce because you had dry states like Kansas, right next to wet states like Missouri, Kansas City, heavily Catholic city at the time. So it was very hard to enforce, and the federal government just didn't have the people to enforce it. And also the federal government in 1913 was under the control of Democrats, some of whom were for prohibition, especially some from the South, but a lot of whom were not. And President Woodrow Wilson did not have any reason, politically or otherwise, to really want to enforce the law.
Yeah, there wasn't a large federal law enforcement agency back then, or nothing close to what we have today, right? With the ATF and the DEA, all of that. So the temperance movement embraced politics, it seems, from the very beginning. They passed laws at the state level. They were involved in politics with the parties, both parties, right? Republicans and Democrats have what you might call temperance factions or people who are sympathetic to that movement.
Yeah, and you had a Prohibition party. I didn't mention it in
That's
my piece.
Right. Ineffective and small, but
New York Times, but it could be, like third parties often can be. It could make the difference. I won't go down the rabbit's hole of political history too much for you, but folks who listen to this, check out what happened in the 1884 presidential campaign. The Prohibition Party made the difference in New York State. It threw enough votes that would have gone otherwise to the Republican, to the Prohibition Party to give Grover Cleveland the state of New York. And with the state of New York, Grover Cleveland won the presidency. He won the Electoral College. So
wow.
If the Prohibition Party had not been in the field, Grover Cleveland would not have been elected president, almost certainly.
That's amazing. Yeah, they didn't win any states, the Prohibition Party. Let's see, I'm reading a online encyclopedia entry right here. 2 third-party candidates, John St. John of the Prohibition Party and Benjamin Butler of the Greenback Party and the Anti-Monopoly Party, each one less than 2% of the popular
But look
vote.
at New York State.
Yeah.
So John St. John won enough votes in New York State to deny James G. Blaine, the Republican candidate, the electoral
That's amazing.
plurality in New York State. And New York State was by far the largest state in terms of population of the country at the time. I think 10% of all electoral votes were from New York State, kind of like California today. But it was a swing state, unlike California and today. And so if you won New York State, you were 10% on the way to winning the presidency.
So Wayne Wheeler, another name from the past, someone I was not familiar with. He was in charge of the ASL. That's not American Sign Language. That is the Anti-Saloon League. He apparently realized that the Prohibition Party, kind of like some of the anti-slavery parties of the mid-19th century, one-issue parties, right? You weren't going to win an election behind one of these parties. So he understood that he had to work with the major parties. He conceded to the fact that we have this dominant two-party system in his push to amend the Constitution, right? Wayne Wheeler.
Yeah, he was called the Dry Boss. He was a Methodist minister from Virginia, if I remember correctly. And in the 1920s, actually, even though he had, as head of the ASL, he had won over both Democrats and Republicans. In the 20s, the Republicans were the majority party. And Wayne Wheeler was, in effect, wrote laws to enforce and try to toughen the Prohibition Enforcement Acts. And he was very much someone who could make or break politicians in the Republican Party, as long as Prohibition was still popular in the early and mid-1920s. So he was one of the most popular figures in American politics. Again, one whose name is not that well known today. But one of the things that the Anti-Saloon League did, which was very smart, unlike, I think, the anti-abortion movement today, is they said, look, we don't care if you're Democrat or Republican or, for that matter, socialist. Doesn't matter. If you're in favor of our issue, we're for you. That's all that matters to us. And in that sense, they were very practical. You know, they didn't say we're going to make alliances on other issues. No, they said this is the paramount issue, the one issue, the American issue. The Anti-Saloon League called it in their magazine, and therefore we don't really care. We don't care if you drink yourself personally. That's fine, as long as you support prohibiting the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. So it was a very smart strategy, I think.
Maybe that situation applied to American politics a generation ago. It wasn't monolithic, right? Republicans weren't all anti-abortion and Democrats weren't all. I mean, I'm generalizing a little bit.
1970s, you know, it's pretty clear when the anti-abortion movement was still primarily Catholic, run by Catholics. You probably had a lot more Democrats who were anti-abortion than Republicans.
Even into the 1990s, the Republican Party was still fighting over this. I recently watched a news segment about the 1990, it was actually the 96 Republican National Convention in Houston. I take that back. The 92 convention in Houston, George H.W. Bush, who had been a Planned Parenthood supporter earlier in his life, in his political career. The segment was about how the Republicans were still uneasy about coming out too strongly one way or the other. They didn't want to alienate people who were on the fence. Then, of course, we know 96, Susan Molinari, who is a pro-choice Republican congresswoman, gave the keynote address at the Republican National Convention. So it was still a very fluid time there. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And people forget that, you know, a lot of Republicans still are, as we saw in Kansas, are still somewhat ambivalent about this, which is one of the reasons why the anti-abortion movement is going to have a very hard time successfully convincing people outside those already convinced to support their issue. And it'll be impossible for them to do what the Prohibition movement did, which is to actually have a national ban on abortions, even up till, say, 12 weeks or something.
So now I'll get to the main order of business. Michael Kazin, you've been with me many times on the podcast, so you know about my meandering interview style. When things move from the abstract, right, the idea of banning all abortions, to the real world where you now have to defend your position and it gets involved in the democratic process, people who might otherwise be sympathetic to your cause may turn on you when they see the way you're trying to go about achieving it. You write that many people who were behind Prohibition, the temperance crusaders, they ruin their reputations when they look like a bunch of uncompromising scolds and moralists.
Images of people getting arrested for putting something in their bodies that is liquor is something which Americans didn't like in the 1920s, proved unenforceable. You know, power law, I think, is already happening, actually, with abortion, with stories like that terrible story of the 10-year-old from Ohio had to go to Indiana to get an abortion. And now she wouldn't be able to get in Indiana either because Indiana just banned abortions. Enforcing laws that are very hard to enforce create victims, and those victims get identified with. Before there's a law, when abortions are legal, then the narrative for the anti-abortion movement is we have to save these innocent lives. But once the narrative becomes people who are trying to control their own bodies and are afraid of dying from miscarriages not being treated and so forth, all these medical complications that can arise when a woman is pregnant, doctors are not allowed to do that, not allowed to save their lives, have to worry about being prosecuted. The doctors, the women, those related to these people will appear to be victims. And right. Americans like to defend the underdog. And I think that's something already happening, and it's going to happen even more the more you'll see stories about kind of things that will be happening to women who try to get abortions and are not able to.
We're making very slow progress on this front when it comes to narcotics. I think some attitudes are changing there. When it came to prohibition, Daniel Alkrent, in his award-winning book, Last Call, writes, in almost every respect imaginable, prohibition was a failure. It encouraged criminality and institutionalized hypocrisy. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. But it should be noted in the favor of the prohibition movement that this sort of hands-off, no regulation, let the bars stay open 24 hours a day, let 8-year-olds buy liquor. Prohibition did kill that off, I think. We do have liquor control boards. Everyone who wants to sell liquor can't do it. It's not like the 10-year-old selling lemonade on the corner. It used to be, you could sell liquor anytime you wanted to as well. So at least we have some regulation. At least people do ask for IDs when you buy the liquor and so forth. And all that was, in many ways, something which was a legacy, I think, of the prohibition movement. So in that sense, it was not a complete failure, much too much alcoholism in this country, of course. I'm sure there's still corruption involved with selling liquor licenses and so forth, but at least there's some structure of regulation. And there was very little of that before the prohibition movement really got going.
It's not about whether it's right or wrong, right? Drug use, I think most people would agree that using cocaine is wrong. It's what's the best way to do something about it?
Exactly.
An inflexible ban, right? Rigid rules are really difficult in a society like ours, maybe any society throughout human history.
And we have competing rights and claims to rights in the prohibition movement. The prohibition movement claims were, the right of people to be free from the corruption of the saloon interests and the men wasting their money and so forth and debauching their families.
That's right. Domestic abuse was a big problem.
Yeah. And on the other hand, the right to make and buy a beverage that people have been drinking for, in a sense, for hundreds of thousands of years, And now we have the right of the fetus, if you believe the fetus is in fact a human being from the mode of conception, and the right of a woman to control her own body. So when you have competing rights, you have to have some way of making these decisions. We're not going to have we never have had a time when you could get an abortion on demand whenever you wanted to. That's not going to happen again. On the other hand, as I mentioned in my piece, and as we've been talking about, you're not going to have a situation where abortion is banned nationwide either. So we're going to find some kind of compromise. As Roe v. Wade was a kind of compromise, but obviously a lot of people didn't like that.
I think you're right. It falls somewhere in the middle. Americans want abortion to be available with restrictions. I think that's the majority opinion. It's certainly not everybody.
And look, also, if, Bill Clinton used to say, Bill and Hillary Clinton, when they were in office, when he was in office with her as first lady, used to say that abortion should be safe and rare.
That's right. Well, Democrats should also then be willing to compromise on this as well. Not every place in the country is like Texas, but not every place in the country is like California. If it weren't for prohibition, we wouldn't have had the movie The Untouchables, because no one would have known who Al Capone was. I mean, that's what the problem was with prohibition. It turned street thugs like him into kings.
Oh, yeah.
All the corruption.
But again, there's some great movies made about it. So
yeah. Last question: did any of the temperance crusaders admit their fault, or did they keep fighting after prohibition was finally repealed?
Yeah, it's a great question. Which I've never really thought about, and probably should have. I mean, certainly many of them, the politicians, that is, acquiesced to the end of prohibition.
And they needed tax revenue.
It wasn't popular. Tax revenue, that's part of it. And also, the Democrats who have been supportive of prohibition, especially Southern Democrats, were quite happy when, with FDR, who was opposed to prohibition, they got back into power in 1933. So they weren't going to push prohibition anymore. And that was true for most Republicans as well. So what they decided to go, well, we can sort of like what abortion was like before Roe v. Wade was still a law of the land, and perhaps we'll happen again, you can have local option. And you're still in many parts of the country, like in Utah, where the Mormons are opposed to drinking alcohol, you can have counties and cities which make it illegal to buy liquor, so you have to buy somewhere else and bring it in there. But we haven't gone back and not going back to the situation where it was completely banned. You couldn't drink alcohol anywhere.
Well, one last observation from Okrent's book. Mississippi remained legally dry until 1966. Providing what he calls the outstanding example of official self-delusion. Liquor sales were outlawed, but for 10 years, a 10% tax on illegal sales remained in place, which encouraged the state to encourage lawbreaking.
Yeah, a lot of great blues music was played in juke joints where alcohol was available.
I raise my glass to you, Michael Kazin.
And to you, Martin.
Well, if Michael Kazin and I ever get around to having a beer together, we are not going to invite Carrie Nation to come along. She and her hatchets can stay home. Michael Kazin of Georgetown University, the author of What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. And one more note about the abortion debate, or maybe I should call it the abortion conflict. It is going to take years for all of this to play out. Some states probably will ban abortion, maybe entirely. Other states are going to keep it legal, and it will take time to resolve the conflict between these differing state laws. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be the next installment of my occasional series, Slavery and the Constitution. We'll be joined by Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, who is an academic historian of the early American slave trade, and his organization's new report on the exhibits at Montpelier, Monticello, and Mount Vernon. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.